All right, let's keep going. We're at this here. Let's keep it rolling. Now let's look at the courts in action. We think of the terms activist courts as something we hear a lot in the news. That was not a concern to Hamilton, right? It's probably the weakest of all the branches. So when we think of a court in action, what does that mean? What are we talking about? Well, let's look at two ideas. Let's look at judicial restraint versus judicial action. So judicial restraint usually means that the people on the bench have a very strict interpretation of the Constitution, and they're usually going with original intent. And they usually only really act on cases that have clear constitutional questions. Whereas judicial action, there may be a more loose interpretation of the court. It's once again considered a living document, and they are more apt to embrace the guardian ethic, that it is the job of the court to help society in ways that it feels it has the power to do so. Now, we're going to point out that judicial restraint or judicial action does not have to align with ideology or party. For example, we learned earlier this year about Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson looking at the 14th Amendment with things with voting and with race. And there was the one interpretation, which was a precedent, really, that said that race, you can't look at race. Race can't be a factor. And she said, well, when the 14th Amendment was written, it was a Reconstruction amendment. Race was a factor into why it was written. It was written because of race. So don't get like party or ideology confused with this, because that was actually using original intent when she explained it like that. So, like I said, it's not aligned to ideologies such as conservative or liberal. Often, judges or courts are labeled activist courts when it does something that people don't like. And both sides can be considered activist courts. For example, when the liberal Warren Court defended many civil rights decisions, it was labeled as being too activist. But when the conservative Rehnquist Court overturned many liberal precedents, that was being labeled as too activists. So it's something to keep in mind. We're going to quickly go right into 2.11, which is checks on judicial power. So we learned about how Congress, how the executive checks the other branches. How does the judicial branch check the other branches? Well, there's a few ways. They can have the legislative branch can make legislation that actually impact court decisions. They can have legislation that modifies the impact of a SCOTUS decision. So an example, we already learned about US v. Lopez and how the court said that the Commerce Clause does not apply. You can't make the gun-free school zone by using the Commerce Clause. We're all for what you're doing, but the way you're doing it doesn't work. So what Congress did is they made a law that sort of worked with their decision and didn't use the Commerce Clause. So they found a new way to make gun-free school zones. Congress can also cut or increase funding to impact various policies. They can also have oversight hearings. We learned today in the news about some of these new members on the Oversight Committee and why that's a big deal. And also, they can advise and consent with the nominees, like we mentioned when Kavanaugh was being vetted, right? That they get their part there. Something else to keep in mind is that they can try to make laws on courts' decisions. Going back to the Dobbs decision, you see that a lot now. You might not see that a lot now that we have a Republican Congress, but while we did have a Democratic House, you saw them try to push laws to try to codify Roe. So you see them trying to use whatever powers they can to sort of impact some of the court decisions. You also have the executive branch. What can they do? And there's an example in a story, and it's an unfortunate story. I don't think that reveals bias, because it dealt with the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831, and we can discuss the merits of this case more. You'll learn about it if you take a push. Um, and it dealt with reservations and what a president can or can't do. Basically, long story short, the court made a decision, and I don't know if favored is the right word to use to say it favored the Cherokee Nation, but it sort of pointed out things that the federal government could or couldn't do on their reservation. And President Jackson basically said, John Marshall, who was a Chief Justice, has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Well, we've already said that the judicial branch has no enforcement power. The president is supposed to enforce these things, but if they don't want to, like, can you impeach a president over this? Well, I guess if you want to, right? But this time, Congress did not want to. So just because the Supreme Court declares something, right, you now need actual enforcement. And sometimes we'll see, right? Sometimes enforcement takes a while. We see that with some of the court cases, especially after the Civil War. And unfortunately, Jackson's refusing to enforce this Marshall decision is what led to the Trail of Tears. And we do know, about that awful situation. So basically, the executive branch can refuse to enforce a decision. It can use an executive order to address something related to it. And something that, like we said, can last decades is if they can change the ideological composition of the court if someone dies, if someone resigns. Some presidents don't get that chance. We can talk about the idea of court packing. That's a whole other situation that maybe we can get to um, some other time. And I believe that is all I have for you on the judicial branch. We'll talk much more in class, but if you have questions, jot them down. I'd love to discuss them. All right, next we get to talk about everyone's favorite thing. That's bureaucracy. All right.